and my apologies for folks that are still in line. Is just a sign of how much excitement and interest there is in this particular conversation today. So we thank everyone for being here. So our event today is titled Countering Authoritarianism in the United States, Strategies for Pro-Democracy Organizing and Nonviolent Resistance. My name is Yanilda González, and I'm an assistant professor of public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm going to start with just a little bit of housekeeping on behalf of the Ash Center, which is our host for and our sponsor for this event. So first, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. This panel is also being live streamed, which means that all of our remarks will need to be spoken into a microphone, including questions from the audience. So we thank you in advance for sharing the mic. We'll reserve the last, it says 15 minutes, but we're going to try to do 20 to 25 minutes for audience Q&A given our big attendance today. Now, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers for today. We're so excited and really fortunate to hear from these three experts on this particular question of organizing against authoritarianism here in the US. So first up will be Erica Chenoweth, who is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment here at HKS, and a Susan and Kenneth Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard. They study political violence and its alternatives. At Harvard, Chenoweth also directs the Nonviolent Action Lab, an innovation hub that provides empirical evidence in support of movement-led political transformation. Next, we're going to hear from Zoe Marks, who is a lecturer in public policy here at HKS. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of conflict and peace building, as well as gender, racism, and inequality, particularly in the African context. Chenoweth and Marks are the co-authors of an exciting new working paper called Pro-Democracy Organizing Against Autocracy in the US, which is the inspiration for our conversation today. After we hear from Erica and Zoe, we're really excited to also hear from our colleague Liz McKenna, who's going to serve as a discussant. So Liz is an assistant professor of public policy at HKS as well. And McKenna's work draws on multiple methods, including ethnographic work, interviews, geospatial analysis, and social network analysis to study organizations, power, and political change. Her current research agenda examines how civil society can both enable and constrain democracy. So you can see why Liz would have a lot to say about this particular working paper. So we're going to hear from Erica and Zoe first. We're going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to bring in Liz for her talk, for her remarks, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And I might use my moderator privileges to also chime in, depending on timing. So with that, please let me join me in welcoming Erica and Zoe for their remarks.
It's really exciting to see the turnout, and I look forward to the conversation. So I wanted to start by giving a little background into the motivation for this study in the working paper that we're going to be referring to a lot today. If you haven't seen it, you can download it from this event website, or if you start to find but the way that project came about is that Zoe and I were asked in 2021 by a group called Social Media Justice Leaders, which is a kind of visioning and strategy hub for progressive organizing, to do a strategic assessment of the capacity of our country, the United States, to effectively mobilize a massive nonviolent pro-democracy movement in the event of an authoritarian takeover at the national level in 2024. So our remit from this outfit was not to try to speculate about how to prevent such a thing from happening, or to speculate about the likelihood of such a thing happening, but more to try to understand the level of preparedness by effectively the pro-democracy sector writ large in the United States to respond effectively to that type of event. So what we did was we
undertook a couple of different types of research. We did interviews with people across the country who are situated in different parts of what you might describe as the pro-democracy sector, people in different progressive organizing formations, and different groups that were already mobilized toward trying to protect democracy in various ways. And we also did a historical comparative analysis of different settings where there were effective pro-democracy movements that effectively responded to and ousted far-right authoritarian regimes. So in particular, we looked at Chile, South Africa, and the United States Deep South. And what we learned is that there were a number of kind of disturbing similarities between the way things were going in particular US states in the last few years that were echoes of previous kind of collapses into authoritarianism in different democracies. So to finish kind of motivating the study, I just want to talk a little bit about Florida. So in the past 4 years, the now reelected governor in Florida has overseen some really important changes in the level of democracy in that state. For example, in the aftermath of a major referendum to re-enfranchise over 1 million voters in the state by a state referendum in which over 60% of voters authorized former felons having the right to vote again. As soon as the governor stepped in and took power and kind of aligned with the legislature, they actually passed laws disenfranchising those people again by effectively applying a poll tax to their vote. He also created an election police force, which this last summer rounded up over a dozen people for breaking the law, committing voter fraud, all of whom were people who were disenfranchised under this new law and didn't know it, and are, some of them have had their cases thrown out, but 12 of these people were Black voters, and the state has a very troubled relationship with its Black constituency. In the aftermath of the 2020 uprisings related to the killing of George Floyd, the governor introduced a really intense voter restriction law, which greatly expands the definition of what it means to take place in a riot, which includes being present at a protest in which there's a road blockade or there's damage to property. For people who are arrested under this new law, it eliminates pretrial bail and comes with a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years in a felony charge. In addition, the law includes provisions for civil immunity for people who drive their cars into crowds of protesters injuring them so that they cannot be sued by the people that are injured. And it also threatens to remove state funding from municipalities that reduce their police budgets as a way to deter anybody from, quote unquote, defunding the police. So this was a very specific law that targeted Black protest and Black protesters. Black protest in Florida has plummeted in terms of the volume and the sort of intensity of it in the aftermath of the enactment of this law in April of 2021. This is also coming on the heels of many different types of acts and bills that are trying to, restrict what people can teach in schools with regard to LGBTQ people, restrict what they can teach in schools with regard to American history, and normalizing kind of authoritarian politics, particularly toward the treatment of immigrants. If you were aware of the stunt that took place last summer with Venezuelan people who were flown here from Texas on the governor's dime. So what I want to say about this before I hand it to Zoe is that it might seem like these things just affect people in Florida, voters in Florida. It's true that these people are the most vulnerable and the most intensely affected in the short term. But if you think about the effects of the partisan gerrymandering that have taken place in the state, which were intended to basically eliminate Black plurality voter districts, then the results of their elections affect the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And that then affects national politics. I'll also say that the protest bill that was passed has had at least 32 copycat bills introduced around the country. 11 other states, red states, have adopted the same bill. So in Iowa now, it's also true that if you drive your car into a crowd of protesters, you are immune from civil liability. And the third thing is, of course, the stunt with the migrants is a good example of how authoritarian politics in one state affects the well-being of everyone in the country. So we are talking about an authoritarian wave and a situation in our country where authoritarian politics is becoming more intense and more normalized in key states in a way that affects us all.
Thanks, Erica. Is this, it's good? Okay. It feels like it's not quite as loud. Can y'all hear me at the back? Yes? No. The other mic is better. They're notoriously dodgy lav mics in this room. I don't want to derail us, but I just want to give a special shout out to the catering staff who have been running back and forth. Thank you so much. You're doing an incredible job and like the work of 4 people. So as you all know, at least from the invitation, this is part of a broader report. Erica's laid out the context for what we describe as increasingly consolidated state-level authoritarianism, and the report is really geared at thinking about what happens if there's federal-level authoritarianism. So without a walkthrough of the structure of US government, it does only take a couple of Floridas for authoritarianism to consolidate at the federal level in the United States. And so through the course of, the several dozen interviews, as well as kind of broader scanning of the horizon around what organizing is being done in the US at the local, state, and national level, we came away with a sort of rough diagnostic of the current context of pro-democracy or anti-authoritarianism organizing. And the first kind of key takeaway is that from the diagnostic is that an electoral partisan emphasis is not going to serve us in the context of an authoritarian takeover starting in 2024. And it's worth acknowledging that an authoritarian takeover doesn't just mean that the party that you wanted to win didn't win, right? The whole context of authoritarianism is around the alignment of several forms of anti-democratic governance consolidating to reduce competition formally within the electoral sphere, and also to consolidate electoral authoritarianism, which is where the process for changing policies and for changing representatives is no longer free and fair and competitive, right? And so an electoral authoritarian landscape, which is the prevailing form of authoritarianism globally today, and the one that's most likely in the United States, were there to be authoritarian consolidation at the national level, would by definition make electoral partisan organizing across the political spectrum not the most useful tool to change authoritarianism and revert back to democracy, right? So when the electoral system is rigged, electoral tools are one part of the toolkit, but a broader array of movement strategies is required. And so what we've seen up until this point is a real emphasis, particularly on the progressive side of the spectrum, but also throughout the kind of conservative and centrist part of the political spectrum in the United States, to think about electoral politics as like the room where it happens. You see this sort of cycle of every 2 years, people get excited, there's political power, and what we're worried about is that no longer being enough to create meaningful change or defensive rights within the United States. And so when we look beyond an electoral partisan emphasis in the kind of political landscape in the US, we see that there's significant fragmentation amongst constituencies and organizations that are pro-democracy by definition, according to their self-stated priorities and mission, but that are pro-democracy in these sort of single issue areas where it's issue first and democracy second. And so what would be required if there were to be a shift towards an authoritarian consolidation in the United States is for it to become the other way around. Democracy first, issue second, because without democracy, the issues can't follow. And so part of the challenge is dealing with the sort of issue-based fragmentation, Sometimes these issues take the form of identity groups or communities or regions in which people are being organized. And so that leads to the second and intersecting form of fragmentation that we see in the landscape currently, which is fragmentation between national level organizations that often control funding, that sometimes control access to media, and that overwhelmingly get to set the agenda, and local level organizing, which really has boots on the ground, not only to get people together and to give a sense of purpose, but to tie politics to local issues. And so both the national level orgs and the local level organizers are doing a fantastic job at what they're doing, but it's not always joined up, and the extent to which it's joined up isn't always shaping the agenda at the national level. So that's the diagnostic in the report. What we end up recommending are 4 key strategic steps that would be required in the event of an authoritarian takeover. And I keep saying takeover like we'll know when it happens, right? But you don't know when authoritarianism has sort of washed over the shores and the sandcastles are down. And so the way to think about this sort of what's required is really to think about, do we have these tools in place now to protect and defend democracy, regardless of this sort of patchwork or mosaic of emerging anti-democratic policies and governance that have already taken shape across the 50 United States. So the first and most important strategic objective that we recommend is a united democratic alliance or pro-democracy alliance. And we're really talking about democratic as democracy defending. This is competition. This is access to free and fair information. This is the extent to which people are willing to accept election results and abide by the rules of the game, right? This is a minimal standard for democracy. The reason a united front approach or a broad alliance is required is to have a full democracy in the United States. We're still working towards revising the context of democracy that we have inherited from the nation's founding. And so it's really thinking about what is an anti-racist, pro-democratic, radically inclusive, and feminist democracy in which all people within the United States have free and full access to the ballot box, have equal representation under the law, et cetera, et cetera. And so the goal is to see this as a sort of horizon rather than something that we already have that we're trying to kind of compete over how to defend. The other reason this broad-based alliance is necessary is not only to improve on the state of democracy currently, which is to an extent part of the problem, but it's also to ensure that the movement, the sort of anti-authoritarian movement, is as effective as possible. So in work that Erica and I have been doing cross-nationally, we find that inclusive movements, particularly movements with 25 to 50% or more gender inclusivity, broad-based national representativeness, they're more likely to be large enough to succeed, and they also can pull on the pillars of support of the authoritarian to actually induce defections. And so larger movements are significantly more likely to succeed, and inclusive movements in the United States are more likely to be large. So that brings me to the next 3 steps, and I'll move a little bit more quickly through these. The second is this united alliance really needs to think about alternative strategies to street protest in order to maintain a sustainable and effective anti-authoritarian movement. So again, we're working on this in the event of somebody pulling the authoritarianism alarm, but you can imagine why this could also be important now at the state level and how we've seen this come through in previous sort of generations of protest politics in the US. And specifically what we're looking at here is the building of power within the polity. So that means alternative institutions. It looks like mutual aid. It looks like direct pro-democracy relief for natural disasters. We've seen that this is not necessarily a partisan or pro-democracy space. The Proud Boys were mobilizing in Kentucky in response to the flooding and giving people their basic needs. If a pro-democracy alliance isn't showing up for people's basic well-being, then it makes it look as though democracy is irrelevant to people's material survival. Particularly under authoritarianism, where we know that certain communities will be hit more powerfully by authoritarian politics and repression. We want to be sure that a united alliance is serving everyone to their need, not just equally in terms of their sort of visibility or proximity to power and privilege. And then finally, a key sort of pillar of thinking about movement work going forward is to ensure that there's a full repertoire of economic tools. So that includes coordinated strike action up through a general strike, and boycotts of key pillars that are supporting an authoritarian regime or authoritarian alliance. It brings me to the third key tool, which is to be able to elicit defections from particularly corporations and other pillars of support, the news media, key elites, and then also base actors that are otherwise upholding an authoritarian status quo. And this is where you can really begin to imagine what this has looked like as a bolster for democracy at the state level that would be required on a national stage. And then finally, authoritarianism is not friendly and it's not always institutional alone. So what would be required is developing resilience across a pro-democracy movement space to violence, to violent repression, and also to sort of paragovernmental or paramilitary attacks. This is important because any repression against pro-democracy activists needs to backfire. It needs to be seen as attacking a movement that in its resilience is demonstrated to be stronger than the authoritarian target. Authoritarian violence and pro-authoritarian violence needs to be seen as an expression of weakness, and it also needs to be seen as morally illegitimate.
So in terms of what can be done now to sort of build out an organizational infrastructure for a united democratic alliance, Zoe and I recommend just doing a few things now between now and 2024, 2025. And if we don't need to stand up a massive anti-authoritarian alliance in the end, these will do no harm to our to our society. In fact, it will strengthen pro-democracy civil society in a way that is perhaps long overdue. So the first is to convene 5 cross-cutting summits among different organizers and organizations who can imagine themselves as being central to the leadership of United Democratic Alliance. The second is to help think about and potentially experiment with different modes of communication other than the ones that a lot of people have been relying on, and that these different modes of communication would need to be diverse. Not everybody is on TikTok. Still, I am not on it. I don't need to be on it. I'm not central to this effort, but there are other people who might be central to the effort who are also not on TikTok. And so the idea is just to think about developing a communications and information ecosystem that is associated with the Pro-Democracy Alliance, as a way to sort of push back on much of the information ecosystem that is either co-opted by, particular partisan identities, or that's been pretty effective in building a culture of authoritarianism. So we need an alternative to that. The third thing is to really get serious about building an opposition power map. So finding out who are the different pillars of support, who is investing in authoritarianism in the country right now, what are their relationships, what are they getting out of it, who are their connections, to try to better understand, which of the pillars is really the easiest to induce defections from. This is related to the need for more robust scenario and strategy planning. So before the 2020 election, there was a large amount of kind of scenario planning about what if Trump does certain types of things like, have a coup. And the reality is that a lot of people were quite prepared for that possibility because there'd been scenario planning. But the scenario planning was late. It was pretty fragmented. And if there were basically 100 people in the country who weren't in the positions they were in at that point, it could have gone very differently. And so this is just a call to try to do that earlier and in a more coordinated and sustained way. The next feature of our suggestions is trying to develop popular education and training that could be shared in a broad curriculum across all different sectors of civil society and education. And then last, we suggest really trying to link up with a lot of the other pro-democracy movements around the world right now. Part of the reason for this is because autocrats link up and autocratic movements link up with autocracies abroad. That's happening actively, openly, in public. And the same level of vigor and intensity is not being undertaken by pro-democracy movements and trying to learn from each other how we can coordinate and build effective strategies. So with that, I think we'll stop with the overview and turn it over to Liz.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Ash for organizing, to my wonderful colleagues, and all of you for being here. I feel very lucky that I am in the respondent position. I'm just going to take 10 minutes, and then I think we'll open it up for discussion. So I'll start by saying that I felt a mix of both despair and hope when reading this memo, and I honestly just went through that same roller coaster again in hearing these comments, despair to hope and back again. There's an undercurrent of real fear that democracy is still very much on knife's edge, both in the United States and around the world. And the memo really treats that seriously, the existential threats that democracy faces. At the same time, reading the paper actually stirred in me a feeling that is completely foreign to me when I'm reading scholarly work, which is an instinct to take action. I actually felt motivated. Typically in university spaces like this one, we thrive on critique. The nature of the profession is one that cultivates and rewards diagnoses of problems rather than constructive intervention. So what Chenoweth and Marks offer is nothing less than an urgent and highly constructive list of recommendations, a point of departure for real, smart, collective action, and takes us far beyond an exhaustive catalog of the problem. So I won't review the recommendations, which Zoe and Erica did very well, but I will say that my comments should be taken in the same kind of constructivist cue to think through what are the concrete ways in which these recommendations might actually be implemented. So first, one of the things that I appreciated most about the argument is that it is both historically and globally grounded. It moves us away from a US-centric presentism, even as it helps us think more critically and comparatively about what is similar and distinct about the US as one in a set of cases of this third wave of autocratization. But one of the challenges of zooming out to this very valuable internationalist perspective is that when we're talking about something as difficult and organizationally complex as building a multiracial, anti-fascist united front, the devil is truly in the details. So the front that they call for must have this extraordinary array of capacities. And here I'm going to quote to make sure I didn't miss any. Communications, education, training, intelligence, community power building, scenario planning, conflict resolution, and diplomacy. So an extremely tall order to stand up in less than 2 years' time. They give us a little bit of a sense of what this might look like. They write that it could have a general secretariat with federated structures that takes full responsibility with a clear, central, and relational glue, along with significant financial resources. So here's where I think we can and must go further. We have to open up the organizational black box to understand what the structure of such a movement would look like. So the actual group level mechanics of what this united front does and how it performs these functions. So some of the questions that this raised for me were, how is the federated body structured? What are the lines of accountability? How is decision-making structured? Who controls the funds and with what authority? What are the collective practices that help build the relational glue of this united front? And how will we know it when we see it? What are the indicators that the front or pro-democracy infrastructure is becoming more versus less robust? So these are not questions I would expect to be answered in full in a paper of this length, but I do think that questions about how groups internally organize and structure their work, especially around something as high stakes as this, are among the most pressing questions in need of answers right now. So second, the paper offers a measured treatment of the role of elections and what they describe as flashpoints. These are battles in a much longer war, they're peaks in a long historical campaign, but nonetheless crucial mobilizing moments. So this point about elections as flashpoints reminded me of research by the political scientist and legendary union organizer Jane McAlevey. In her book, appropriately called No Shortcuts, McAlevey coined the term structure test to describe the mini mobilizations that test the strength of an organization and its leadership to actually assess whether the people the movement has identified as leaders actually have followers that they can move into action repeatedly. So Chenoweth and Marks point to a tension among pro-democracy practitioners who sometimes see mobilizing, usually around elections, as one tradition, and organizing and leadership development as a separate one. And they correctly point out that the two are hardly incompatible. It's counterproductive to think of them as much. But what I think McAlevy's research adds is a useful insight that moves us away from this mobilizing, organizing binary and instead focuses on the much more primary and, in my view, important question of leadership. So when we think through this deep well of nonviolent tactics beyond street protests, perhaps our North Star should actually be, are we actually building a strong, deep bench of interconnected, progressive leaders? Or are we spending down and churning through activists in these flashpoints? So here, I think as researchers, we can and should take a good hard look at the answer to that question in relation to what happened in the wake of the mass protests of the past 5 years or so. They list them in the paper: the Women's March, March for Our Lives, the Science March, Families Belong Together, the 2020 racial justice uprisings, and of course now the record high turnout mobilization events of 2020 and now 2022. So the central question becomes, to what extent did these flashpoints, these mobilizations, serve as crucibles where new leadership for the long-term struggle were tested and forged? And if the answer is no, that new leadership did not emerge from there and we were actually spending down activists, then I think the crucial question of the United Front is, how do we make sure to sustain that over time? Third, and relatedly, I want to turn to the paper's brief but very excellent critique of the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that its incentive systems reward groups that look and act like mini corporations rather than groups that actually source their power from and are wholly dependent on an organized constituency base. So what I want to underscore here is the often overlooked link, I think, between this observation about the nonprofit 501c3 being the primary way that collective action is organized in the United States, and a separate point that Zoe touched on about how authoritarianism doesn't always come in the form of cavalry and tanks and an overnight coup. Authoritarianism, they point out, emerges in many forms and in many places in our daily lives, in the halls of power of DC, all the way down to the hyperlocal institutions like the school board, local newspapers, and radios. So this intervention challenged me, and I think challenges us, to think about how authoritarianism reveals itself to us every day, even in civil society organizations that we are a part of. We simply are not used to, nor do we have, organizational templates for civil society arrangements where leaders are directly accountable to their people rather than to philanthropy dollars via a constituency with a voice over the policies that govern them. So what I would argue is that we're so steeped in these micro-authoritarian practices that this experience of being a member with a voice in a civil society organization is woefully lacking and something we must figure out how to do at scale if the United Front is to materialize. So to the question about the 5 summits, how do we decide who comes to those summits? By what authority are they given? Do they have a base of people that gave them that authority, or were they nominated by elites, for example? A quick point on defections, and then I'll wrap up. But the imagery of defection examples in the paper are all of kind of elites or high-level government officials, cultural influencers, and whistleblowers in positions of power. But the question that raised for me was, well, what do we do with the rank and file fascist sympathizers? Authoritarian leaders, of course, enjoy the veneer of populist legitimacy when they have the support of the masses, which in my view means we must focus the organizing work not only on elite defectors, but on ordinary people who are or were swayed by Trumpism and the MAGA project. So I'll wrap up with a final thought, which is a bit of reaction to the focus on scenario planning and gaming out resistance scenarios in the event of a full-scale authoritarian takeover. And Erica touched on this at the end, so this is not totally a fair critique. But I was saying, my view is that this work needs to happen absolutely no matter what, not only if there is a hypothetical transition to authoritarianism. So one gets the sense right now that history is very much up for grabs, and the pro-democracy movement is facing a very formidable opponent in which the GOP is effectively the political arm of a fascist movement. But what I would argue in the face of that is we don't need a perfect blueprint or strategy, but we need to get deep into the weeds about what the internal functioning of what this powerful united front must look like. And then that movement or organization can iteratively develop strategy over time as the terrain shifts, as it inevitably will. So as Zoe and Erica convincingly point out, this is the work that we must do to build our collective democratic capacities if we're to face this rising tide of authoritarianism in 2024 and beyond. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Zoe and Erica for bringing these really important insights and research findings to this space, and to Liz for sharing her reactions to this as well, sort of given your work on the subject. I wanted to now open it up for Q&A. What we're going to do is we're going to take rounds of 3 questions, and then give Zoe and Erica a chance to respond, and then we'll collect more questions just to allow a bit more conversation. And I am going to use my moderator's privilege to sort of add my own sort of 2 quick reflections and slash questions, and I'll try to model succinctness for everyone here. So the first is that I was very struck by the timeliness, of course, of this paper, given our elections last week, and conversations that were happening mostly among elites, in spaces like Twitter and the media, pundits, but also academics, political scientists, many of whom were saying, where was the authoritarian takeover? The institutions held up, all of you were just being hysterical. And including, these are debates that were happening among our own colleagues in the Gov department and other sort of political science departments, just a little inside baseball. But so it's really interesting to sort of say, okay, what do we do when this, or how do we take it when this organizing is so successful that the threat does not manifest, and then seemingly undermines the need to do this kind of pro-democracy organizing? And my second question slash observation, based on my own research, right, is that we know that authoritarian enclaves can live very comfortably within democracies, right? There's a lot of big literature on subnational authoritarianism, which of course we know in the United States, the South, the Jim Crow South, folks have written about how that constituted a subnational authoritarian enclave within the US. And my own work is about institutional authoritarian enclaves, right? Police operating as authoritarian institutions within otherwise democratic states. So how do we think about strategies if we sort of continue to consolidate those types of authoritarian enclaves versus a federal takeover, authoritarian federal takeover? So I'll just sort of leave those for everybody to think about, and Zoe and Erica may chime in, may address those if they wish. But I want to first open it up for to collect first 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll give Zoe and Erica a chance to respond to kind of these, and then collect another round. Yes.
There have historically been organizations that were interested in democracy, political but nonpartisan, and chapter-based in their communities, such as still the League of Women Voters. There was a time that the General Federation of Women's Clubs was a major organization. I learned last night online that it still exists, but I was unaware that it still existed. It was big a century ago. Now, these organizations may not be on board with everything in the progressive agenda that you seem to put down as a requirement. But are you thinking about something that could be supported by the League of Women Voters and other such groups that are basically civics oriented good government organizations rather than historically partisan organizations? And of course, these organizations, such as the League of Women Voters, don't have the woman power that they used to have when there were loads of highly educated women who were not employed full time. So there are challenges, but they're still there.
Do we have 2 more questions? Yes, we've got.
Hi, I'm Joanne. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I'm a mid-career here and kind of reimagining what my last 20 years of work will be like. What is something practical? I'm from Tennessee. We have a Republican supermajority in both houses. We just reelected an extremely popular governor who I think fits the definition of what we're talking about. So when I go home, what do I do?
Yes, and the third question up front here.
Thanks for this great presentation, very inspiring. Also, I shared the inspiration to action. I wanted to underline one of the discussant comments and hope that the panel would speak to this question of what you would do to address the kind of broader support for authoritarianism. I think that's a really hard question and maybe is a field from what you're talking about, but I don't know how to think about engaging. I don't know that providing information, for example, we know that providing information hardens and entrenches opposition often. So I'm wondering if you have any brilliant ideas about how to change minds at the heart, change hearts and minds.
Okay, these are great questions. So first, Yanilda, to your question about like, what do we say, given that the elections last week weren't as bad as a lot of people were expecting? Well, I think that the election results are still unknown, but they're also pretty bad in some places, right? So this is kind of what part of what we're talking about is that the number of votes cast in the country were still cast with people who decided that it was okay that there was a January 6th insurrection, and that the 300 plus people who were candidates in that party refused to acknowledge the outcome of the 2020 election. And we still have like a very large stuck kind of constituency that is in favor of basically an authoritarian movement. It's not going away. It's not going to go away in the next couple of years, although I do think that it can be diminished in its size. And I think the main thing is that in certain places, it got deeper, right? So in Florida, it got deeper. In Georgia, it may get deeper, and various other states in the deep South, it got deeper. In Texas, and a lot of it is because of successful efforts by authoritarian leaders to suppress votes and to redistrict in a way that favors their partisan identity and to crush opposition and to prevent what people are allowed to legally say and do. So their election proved that those measures work great, right? And that's the conversation happening there. So I think that the conversation that it wasn't as much of a bloodbath as otherwise might have been expected is a thing that like liberals tend to do, which is think about our elections as a national project. And the reality is that the most important political events that happen in this country happen first at the state level, and then that affects us at the national level. So everything about the sort of United Democratic Alliance has to be led by the states. It has to be led by organizers that are firmly situated in states and networks of state-based organizers who are the closest to the most acute authoritarian crises and can, share what they need from those of us who live elsewhere. I think that the issue about broader support for authoritarianism, there are a lot of organizations out there that are really working on this. There are organizers in very deep red areas that, work in rural organizing and try to do a lot of transpartisan work. And the issue there is that a lot of times the national conversations that take place kind of take all the oxygen out of their organizing possibilities. And things that I've heard people say who are organizing in sort of deep red rural areas is, people are sick and they're tired and they actually don't like the sort of toxic polarization or whatever, but their material needs are not being met. So if you're not going to meet their material needs and you're not going to give them something that they can like deeply spiritually identify with as like a powerful point of identification and belonging, then they're not going to come along. And authoritarian forces, they're not meeting their material needs either, but they're giving them something to believe in and something to belong to. And so uncomfortable as it is, there are groups like Surge, for example, that has a very robust organizing infrastructure and, is probably going to absorb a lot of the sort of momentum that is coming out of this election in terms of voter engagement. And, I think that that's a natural place for a lot of people to go who are white and who are trying to find ways to diminish, the appeal of authoritarianism, particularly among white voters. Other than that, I think I'll ask Zoe to weigh in on the League of Women Voters question and something practical that our mid-career can do in Tennessee.
Is it Joanne? Is that? Yeah. What should I do with my life? You tell me and I'll tell you. All right, I want to underscore a couple of points that Eric has already made, which is that as we think about like democracy didn't get as destroyed as everyone expected, like that's a pretty low bar in my view for the American democracy project. But more than 200 of over 300 big liars won. So that means the vast majority of people who ran on the big lie, who won their primary election on the basis of being Trump loyalists and MAGA diehards, have succeeded and so are now in power. And that also means that is the majority of those who ran didn't have the opportunity to say, like, my election was a fraud because I lost, right? So it's the minority who were tested. And I think it's really important to give credit to those who did high-profile concession speeches, which I do think helped set a standard for what would happen. And we didn't see a massive contagion effect of everyone who endorses the big lie then saying that their own election loss was a lie, right? But that doesn't mean that that's going to hold in the next round of elections. It doesn't mean that it will hold at the national level when the stakes are greater. And so I want to moderate that and also put some numbers to it. The other thing that I wanted to just kind of boost is this question of culture and identity and the relative lack of cultural resonance or identity-based kind of pro-democracy across the left, across the kind of progressive spectrum, and particularly in communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized from the democratic project, many of which have some of the highest turnout rates in the country in spite of that exclusion and marginalization. That sort of lack of cultural and identity issues really came through in the interviews that we did with organizers throughout the country. And so there is this sense that, democracy is not something that people can get excited about. And yet, I think that the takeaway that I have from the midterm elections is that there is a latent potential for a massive pro-democracy coalition and alliance that, to go to the question about, civil society organizations that are nonpartisan, or some of the organizers on the ground that I describe as transpartisan, where they're really deliberately not trying to be bipartisan, but just trying to transcend partisan rhetoric and partisan thinking. That is something that was tapped into. And we saw this with all of the split ticket voting that happened across the country. And these are relatively big margins of split ticket voting, partly because in a midterm election, you don't have the coattail effect, but we also didn't see the backlash effect against Joe Biden. And so on the issue of the League of Women Voters, I think Erica has this phrase, which is thinking about coalitions as cultivating unity without conformity. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that's exciting about organizations like the League of Women Voters and other civil society spaces like some of our more diverse religious institutions, they have actually been leaders in cultivating unity without conformity. So I think it's not just a question of sort of, do they have a place in a pro-democracy front or pro-democracy alliance, but really what can we learn from how they've done that for decades so that we can think about, well, how do you make the tent bigger without making people feel like they're being subjugated to a sort of a default center, which in American politics has historically been white, middle class or upper class and masculine. On the what do you do in Tennessee, I think that Liz has given some great advice, which is really thinking about, depending on what your sector is, how do you make it more accountable? How do you broaden the voices that are included? If you're interested in sort of formal politics, then I think the key thing is like ensure every election is competitive. And that means revisiting some of the voting laws. It means ensuring that primaries become more democratic in the United States, particularly at the state level. And that, I think that that's the key thing about getting excited about organizing for democracy, means getting excited about the prospect of losing because you lost competitively. And it's not just about sort of winning ideologically and then consolidating that, but rather it's about kind of maintaining these structures that uphold rights and that use the sort of full access to democracy to reinforce rights. And that's the last point that I'll make, is just to close on Laurel's question about, I mean, I think it's so important to stress in an era of electoral autocracy or electoral authoritarianism, authoritarians get voted in and then they don't leave, right? It's not that they're fundamentally unpopular. It's that there is plausible popularity across a wide swath of the population. And we've seen that this is growing. We've seen that this is variable. We could get into some of the demographic findings from exit polls from the last round of elections. But we've also seen that people are surprising the national media with, for example, robust defense of reproductive rights. And that is something that is fundamentally about democracy. And so I think as you start to think about how do you apply this going forward, you can think about actually what are the new and emergent Venn diagrams where people are showing that this is not necessarily a kind of classical bipartisan divide. The language of polarization, I think, has kind of reached its useful limit in talking about American politics. And so it's much more interesting to find out what are these issue areas where there's surprising convergence.
Every mic is different. So let's take another round of 3 questions, and then we'll give a final minute or so for Eric and Zoe to respond. So we've got exactly 3 questions, which is great. First here up front, then hand, yes, the gentleman in the back, and then you with the yes, gray shirt. I like to call out colors of shirts, so we'll start with the dark green here. Yes.
Hi, Sylvia Brody, also mid-career. Thank you so much. I also feel a mix of hope and despair, like people have mentioned. One thing that I'm thinking about is the New York Times article from a number of weeks ago about the influence of Russian bots on the Women's March and the power of sowing division and the way that it's not just internal threats that we're facing here in the U.S. It's also threats from outside, and it just makes me think about the fragmented situation that we're in and how, and I honestly do feel a lot of despair. I feel a lot of hope when I think about the work that groups that Surge and People's Action are doing to really reach across political lines and do deep listening. And also we certainly, the threats we face are just so profound. So I would love to hear you. I'd love to hear some specific ideas on how to counteract those influences.
In the back with the pink shirt.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Name is Jacob and mid-career as well. And you mentioned that we were in the 3rd wave authoritarianism, and I was wondering, there was perhaps some laws passed in Florida, and you mentioned in the Deep South. So I'm wondering, what are some of the key leading indicators that, let's say, this national, also state, local movement could look at to, let's say, flex resources? What would those be? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Greg. I'm all in favor of deepening and growing a progressive and little d infrastructure. But if I were to do a SWOT analysis in the spirit of scenario planning, which is something it's my career, I would look to the blue states more strongly than the report discussed, because the anti-democratic side leveraged democracy to create their advantage. They have infrastructures like ALEC, which I'm not aware of a progressive alternative to ALEC. And so I think if you want to look where there's power that already exists, there's 2 dozen blue states, which are progressive. And we should be working on model legislation. Because, the courts will look to the fact that something exists in 30 states, and they're going to use that as a way to make their decisions. They have the power. So I just was wondering what you were thinking about adding that to one of your pillars.
Excellent question. So I'll let Zoe respond to Sylvia's hard question about threats from outside. Jacob, on the key leading indicators, there's a really cool project called Democracy Scorecard, which basically ranks every U.S. state by, in particular, ballot access. So how easy or hard is it to vote? How fair are the districts apportioned in the state? what are the different, whether there's a partisan or nonpartisan or independent election administration and things along those lines. And I think that's one project that is up to date and maybe a model for this sort of thing. I think the problem is, again, it's sort of obsessed with elections, which are the minimal, standard for democracy, but don't include things like equal protection under the law, different types of civil rights, or the quality of democracy, which means genuine representation and accountability of power to the people. So, there are other indicators I would add to that one. I will also say that Jake Grumbach, who's a political scientist at the University of Washington, has a new book out called Laboratories for Autocracy, in which he talks about different states in the country based on whether they're effectively authoritarian enclaves at this point, and argues that most of the ones that have been under GOP trifectas since 2010 now qualify as authoritarian states. And there's all kinds of different kind of policy implications of that too in terms of behavior. So to your question about the blue states and what role they would play, absolutely. Right now, after this election, we'll have, I think, something like 15 blue state trifectas, maybe 16. That doesn't compare with the GOP's 23, but it's an improvement on where we were before this election. But we still have a number of different divided states. And I think that whatever the United Democratic Alliance is going to have to basically exactly pull on the resources that exist in blue states. I'm actually more interested in newly created trifectas in blue states that just emerged from extremist attacks over the past 4 years, like Michigan and Pennsylvania. I want to know what those organizers did in those states to basically get their communities in a position to reject extremism. I mean, in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer has been the subject of this, plot to kidnap and potentially assassinate her. This was the ground zero for armed overtakings of government buildings, which occurred in April 2020 during the height of the COVID pandemic. It also was a place where, they were experimenting with actually not certifying the 2020 election in various counties until they found out they were being live streamed. And then the GOP leaders either abstained or voted yes, but then regretted it, right? And so it was a place that was really critical in the last 4 years of kind of autocratic and authoritarian experimentation. And the voters of that state just resoundingly rejected authoritarianism, not uniformly, but a sizable majority. And I think what we need to know now, if we were doing Report 2.0, we would compare what happened in Florida and what is happening in Georgia and Alabama with what happened in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and try to understand how we can support the types of resources required on the ground from blue states or from wherever.
Right. To Sylvia's question, the answer is, there's more research is required, which sounds like such a cop-out from an academic, but I haven't done the studies on, sort of survey experimental design or even just opinion polling to see what resonates so that people believe an external threat is real and is a direct challenge to their commitment to democracy or to nation, et cetera. And so I think there are real opportunities to not just expose external threats and have full access to correct information about how foreign actors, loosely conceived, are interfering with American democracy. But I think that the sort of alternative that we should probably spend a little bit more time on, actually, it invokes the question from Greg, is who are actually the people and organizations pulling the levers of local power within the United States. There's a fantastic article in the New Yorker about some of the dark money that's been behind organizing kind of extremist agitation against school boards. And it's really chilling when you think about kind of direct democracy and this opaque curtain behind which a lot of money in politics is flowing. And so I'd like to see a conversation that acknowledges in our globalized system and within a sort of federal structure, we have blurred lines between what's external, right? In Tennessee, which is actually the sort of locus of the article, it's not a stretch to say that the dark money is an external actor, just as Russia is an external actor, right? So who has authority to kind of intervene and how in local politics and in national politics, I think could be part of a broader conversation about democracy and how people think their voice is being heard and which voices are loudest. And so that's not to make an equivalency between the Kremlin and some Koch-funded like dark money orgs that are suggesting that, you know, children can't learn about diversity, but it is to kind of push the agenda a little bit deeper and say, really, who has power in this system and what do we know about where that power comes from?
I believe we are at our time, and it's my job to do the sad task of ending the conversation, at least for the moment. But I want to just thank once again all of you for being here and taking part of this conversation. And I hope it is in fact an ongoing conversation in the way that Zoe and Erica and Liz are calling upon us to do conversation and action. So please join me once again in thanking our panelists, Erica Chenoweth, Zoe Marks, and Liz McKenna. Thank you.